good evening. I'm Kenny Bailey. I'm an agricultural extension agent with the Cumberland County Center of North Carolina Cooperative Extension. And today's topic is going to be heirloom tomato varieties and seed saving. So today what we want to talk to you about heirloom tomato varieties, what that means, and how you can go about saving your seed from year to year so that you can reproduce these varieties without having to buy your own seed, or how you can keep some desirable traits in a variety that you're growing and be able to reproduce that from year to year. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, the reason why we bring these two topics together is, one, tomatoes are probably the most popular garden vegetable. By far the majority of people that have a vegetable garden grow tomatoes, so it's very popular. The second thing is, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a big interest in heirloom tomato varieties. Now, I'll define what an heirloom tomato variety or an heirloom variety is in general in just a minute, but basically people are looking to the older varieties that their parents or their grandparents used to grow in the garden. And so those are what are heirloom tomato varieties. Now, if you want to get into reproducing your own seed to save from year to year and plant your own seed without having to buy those seed every year, tomatoes are probably the easiest crop to get into that. So what we're going to do here today is I want to introduce heirloom tomato varieties, define a few terms that will help you understand later on what we're talking about here. Point out some of those heirloom tomato varieties. There's too many of them for me to go over every one of them, but give you a few examples of what we talk about with heirloom tomato varieties. Then we want to get into the meat of it, and is how do you breed these tomatoes so that you get them true to type every year, and how to save their seed, and then have a few concluding remarks concerning this topic. First of all, let's talk about the pros and cons of heirlooms. Why do we want to grow heirloom varieties or heirloom tomato varieties specifically? Well, probably the number one reason that people would grow an heirloom variety goes back to flavor. There's nothing like the flavor of those old varieties like your parents and your grandparents used to grow. So flavor is probably the number one reason people grow heirloom varieties, particularly heirloom vegetables, because we just don't get that same flavor out of the more modern varieties. Another reason is nostalgia. Growing some of these varieties, I know at least for me anyway, brings back some fond memories of what your grandparents and your parents used to grow in the garden. Another reason is a novelty, and you'll see a few of these varieties are primarily a novelty, but we see this a lot in all the heirloom vegetable varieties. With heirloom varieties, which are open pollinated varieties, which I'll explain more later, you're able to save these seeds, because unlike the hybrid modern varieties, when you save these seeds from the heirloom varieties, they're going to come back true to type. In other words, they're going to come back, if you grow a particular type of variety, when you save those seeds are going to produce that same variety with the same traits. However, there's a caveat to it, and that's part of the purpose of this program, is help you understand how to make sure that these seeds are true to type. And finally, when it comes to the pros, with more and more people getting in, growing and maintaining some of these varieties, it also maintains the genetic diversity that at one time we were losing a handle on, which is very important for future hybrid varieties, some of these crops. So you're doing your part in trying to help maintain this genetic diversity for future breeding programs. Some of the cons to growing heirloom vegetables, and it is a challenge particularly to the new grower, pest pressure is one of the main things. Most of these varieties are not very resistant to pests and diseases. The other thing is the reliability of the production. The uniformity of the yield is lacking there. Also, a lot of these varieties are less vigorous than the newer varieties. So these are some of the reasons why there's some negative aspects to growing these heirloom varieties. Now, however, as a sidebar, with tomatoes, you can overcome some of these issues by grafting some of the older varieties onto the newer variety stock, and you can get some of these, overcome some of these challenges. Now, grafting tomatoes is fairly simple, but it's beyond the scope of this program today. But just understand that there are ways of overcoming these negative issues when it comes to growing heirloom varieties. So let's get into defining some of our terms. We're going to look at what an heirloom variety means. We want to know the difference between a perfect flower and an imperfect flower. Understand what pollination means. Understand different types of pollination, such as self-pollination and cross-pollination. Understanding what it means for a plant to be self-fertile. We want to understand what open pollinated means, because that's very important to heirloom varieties, because all heirloom varieties are open pollinated. We want to define what a hybrid is and understand what that means and why we don't generally try to collect seed off of a hybrid variety. And finally, we want to touch base on some legalities concerning saving your own seed. So we're going to talk about the Plant Variety Protection Act. So when we define an heirloom variety, you may be surprised to find out that there's no hard definition for heirloom variety. However, there's 2 or 3 things that most people agree on when it comes to defining a variety as being heirloom. One of those is it has to be a variety that has been passed down through the generations. It's not something that was just developed or discovered last year. It's been passed down through the generations. Most people agree that it's a variety that's been around at least 50 years or more. And then finally, all heirloom varieties are open pollinated. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to pass these varieties down through the generations and keep them true to type. We want to know the difference between a perfect flower and an imperfect flower, because if you're going to do any type of crossbreeding or protecting, in our case, most of the time we want to protect our plants from being crossbred. You have to understand the difference between a perfect flower and an imperfect flower. Now, just like in animals, plants have male and female reproductive parts. And we usually find that plants are either going to have perfect flowers, which means that they have both the male and female parts on the same flower. And this is the case with tomatoes. Tomatoes are perfect flower plants. And then we have imperfect flowers, which means that a flower either has male parts or it has female parts, but it doesn't have both. And a good example of this would be any member of the cucurbits, which include your pumpkins and your squash. These plants have male flowers and female flowers. And depend on cross-pollination for pollination to take place in these crops. Now, exactly what is pollination? Pollination, in its simplest terms, is a transfer of pollen from the male anther of a flower to the female stigma, either of the same flower or it may be of another flower. But pollination is simply the transfer of that pollen from anther to stigma, and it is the beginning of the process of setting seed and producing fruit. When a pollen grain lands on the stigma of a female flower part, it will germinate a tube. Pollen actually contains the male gamete, the male reproductive cell, roughly comparative to the sperm in the animal. And it'll grow the tube down into the ovary of the female part, which the ovary is what eventually becomes the fruit in a fruit-producing plant. And it must get that male gamete to the ovules, which are the potential seed, and fertilize those ovules and get seed set. If you don't, if this doesn't take place properly, or if it gets incomplete, you're either not going to have any fruit, or you're going to have misshapen fruit wherever there's an ovule that didn't get fertilized. Because without viable seed in there, there's no reason for the plant to produce a fruit, and you're either going to get a misshapen fruit or it's going to abort the fruit altogether. So this process is very important for us making sure that we get these harvestable fruit. Self-pollination is the term used when the pollen from the anther is transferred to the stigma of the same flower or another flower on the same plant. And this is typical of perfect flowered plants, including the tomato. Now, those plants that are capable of self-pollination are also self-fertile, which means that the same pollen from the same plant can pollinate and be successful at setting fruit on another flower on that same plant. Cross-pollination, on the other hand, is what we're concerned about when we want to prevent in order to keep our seed true to type, is when pollen from the anther is transferred to the stigma of a flower of another plant. And this is usually involved in imperfect flowers, but not always, and it's usually between genetically different plants. For example, two different varieties within the same species. Occasionally, in some plants, we might get cross-pollination between different species, but most cases it is the different varieties within the same species, which is what we'll be concerned about with our tomatoes. Now, the term open pollinated, and basically what this means is the plant does not require pollen from a genetically different plant to produce viable seed. In other words, fertilized from pollen from the same plant or from another plant of the same variety. To give you a type of plant to contrast that with, apples, we have to have pollen from a different variety in order for fertilization to take place. But in open pollinated crops such as the tomato varieties we're talking about, we can pollinate with the same pollen from the same plant or from another plant of the same variety. Now this is where the production of what we call true to type offspring comes into play. Many people that talk about open pollinated plants, they'll make the statement, well, you can save those seeds because they are going to be true to type. Well, they're going to be true to type if that plant is pollinated with pollen from the same variety or pollen from the same plant. If you get pollen from another variety, then what you have is a hybrid. That's what your offspring want to be, so it's not going to come back true to type. So we have to control that pollination to make sure that our plants are getting pollen from the same variety in order to get true to type offspring. Now, all heirlooms are open pollinated, as I mentioned earlier. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to hand these varieties down from generation to generation. But not all open pollinated varieties are heirlooms. So be aware of that when you're looking through the seed catalog and you see a variety that's called open pollinated. That doesn't mean that it is an heirloom. And even more importantly, that open pollinated that's not an heirloom may be a protected variety, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. Now, a hybrid is a cross pollination between two genetically distinct plants. It's usually within the same species, but it's not always. Say, for example, if you have, let's say you're growing Charleston gray watermelon and Congo watermelon in the same field. Both of those are open pollinated varieties. But if they cross-pollinate one another, the offspring from those crosses is going to be a hybrid. Now, when it comes to hybrid, we're more interested in what's called the F1 hybrids, which that means simply F1 means the first generation offspring. And in most cases, if you buy hybrid seed, it's going to be the F1 generation. It's most desirable because F1 are usually more vigorous and more likely to be have the reliability we're looking at. F2 generation, in most cases, a cross between two F1s, and the reliability goes downhill from that point. So most times if you buy a hybrid, it's going to be an F1 type of hybrid. The last term to define is plant variety protection. And what that means is that there are some plant varieties that are protected. In other words, they're patented. And these particular varieties, just like a patent on any other invention, is for the one who came up with that variety or developed it. It gives them some protection in the first few years that they can sell that seed exclusively and get back their cost that was involved in protecting that variety. And so in most cases, reproduction for the sale of these protected varieties without permission from the developer or from the seller is prohibited. Now, in most cases, particularly with home gardeners, there is some, and even with some small farmers, there is some limitations on some of these varieties being protected and keeps you from saving your own seed. But for the most part, probably a good 99% of the open pollinated varieties out there, there's no restrictions on saving those seed and using them from year to year. I'm just pointing this out so that you'll check on it and make sure that you're not doing something that'll get yourself in trouble. So how do you know whether a plant variety is protected? Well, it is the responsibility of the owner of the variety or the seller to inform the buyer that the variety is protected. So you should see on a plant protected variety on the label of the seed a statement that may say to the effect, unauthorized propagation prohibited, U.S. protected variety. You'll see that on the label, or you may see in the description or beside the name of the variety in capital letters PVP, which stands for Plant Variety Protection. Those varieties, when you see that, you need to check into it and make sure that it's okay for you to save those seed from year to year. And the reason I point that out is because some open pollinated varieties are protected varieties, and you have to be aware of that. Even though you can conceivably, physically save the seed from those plants and get true to type offspring, that don't mean that you can do it. But for the most part, this is not going to be a big issue for the home gardener. So let's look at a few heirloom tomato varieties. And if you want to open yourself up, particularly if you are a big tomato grower, you like growing tomatoes, but you've been keeping yourself to the mainstream modern varieties, you're going to open yourself up to a whole plethora of flavors, textures, and colors if you tried growing some of the heirloom tomato varieties. And I'm just going to name a few here and point out to you some that are heirlooms. Now, the first one I'm going to point out is Cherokee Purple. And Cherokee Purple, as its name implies, is a purple-colored tomato. The fruit, instead of being red like we're normally used to, is a purple-colored. And it's become very popular and to the point that you can buy transplants of this particular variety on a regular basis in the garden centers in this area. So I know a lot of you are growing Cherokee Purple. Whether you knew it was an heirloom variety or not, it is. So that's one of the first ones, and an example what you see in some of these heirloom varieties. The next one brings back memories to me because I know my grandparents and parents grew this one. This is a pink variety called German Johnson. So I remember that one as a little boy. My grandparents and parents growing that particular pink colored variety. Now this next one I'm going to bring out is called Mortgage Lifter. But there's a story behind the Mortgage Lifter I want to share with you. And if you do some research on a lot of these heirloom varieties, you can find a backstory to how a lot of these were developed. What's interesting about Mortgage Lifter is this was actually developed by a auto radiator mechanic. That's what the guy did for a living. And he developed this particular variety of tomato. This was back in the 1940s. And he sold these transplants from this particular variety for $1 a piece, which was a lot back there in the 40s. And the story goes that he sold enough of those transplants from this variety of tomato that he was able to pay off his home mortgage just from the proceeds of selling those transplants. So hence he named the variety Mortgage Lifter because it got him out of his mortgage on his house. So I'd hate to see what you'd have to sell those plants for today to be able to get yourself out of the mortgage now. So, but anyway, a lot of these varieties do have a backstory to it, and it's interesting just to go back and do some research on them and see what the story is behind those. Homestead is another medium-sized fruit, red tomato that I remember my grandparents and parents growing as a child. And then the classic beefsteak that people like to grow because one slice will cover the bread when you're making that mater sandwich. It's the classic beefsteak, and it is an heirloom variety. It is open pollinated. It is not plant protected. And it's one of those that you can save your seed from year to year if you protect the pollination from it. Getting into some little more exotic type that we see in some of the heirlooms. This is a Roma type called yellow pear. It is shaped like a pear, the fruit is, and it's yellow. So to give you an example of some of the diversity you can see in these heirloom varieties. This is Solar Flare, and it is a striped variety, which is kind of unique. And then finally, this last one called Green Giant. If you are a fan of fried green tomatoes, this might be the variety you want to grow because it stays green even when it's ripe. So you may want to consider growing that if you like that variety and you protect it from cross-pollination. You can save the seed from year to year and you can have all the fried green tomatoes you want. So that's just a handful of tomato varieties that fall under the category of heirloom and open pollinated. So let's get down to what it takes to be able to breed these varieties and keep them true to type. Now, obviously, if you're trying to do this, using the hybrid varieties is out of the question. We don't have any idea what we're going to get out of seed, say from a hybrid variety, other than we're going to get somewhere between with traits of the parents that were involved in making those crosses. But in order to get a seed that's true to type, in other words, if we're growing homestead and we want to make sure that we're going to get homestead out of the next batch of seed that we collect and make it true to type, we've got to make sure that we prevent it from being crossbred. In other words, we got to make sure that the fruit that we're going to harvest for collecting the seed has been pollinated with homestead pollen. So there's three ways that we go about doing that. Those include spacing, timing, and hand pollination. Now, probably the least effective way of trying to prevent cross-pollination in crops is through spacing. Spacing requirements are going to vary between species and the method of how they're pollinated to start with. So let's look at, for example, a self-pollinated plant such as tomatoes. In a home garden, you're going to want to keep them at least 10 to 40 feet apart. And what I mean by that, if you've got more than one variety in there and you want to keep them protected from cross-pollination, you've got to keep them at least 10 to 40 feet apart. Commercial seed producers, to make sure that their seed are true to type, go at least 320 feet out to make sure that those self-pollinated plants don't have any cross-pollination. Now you take a crop that's wind-pollinated, such as corn, you need to keep it spaced, or you need to keep different varieties spaced a minimum of 1,600 feet apart. Because if you don't, you get a good strong wind, that pollen from the other source is going to come in and contaminate your corn. And then even further than that, with insect pollinated crops such as the cucurbits, what I mean by that is the cucumbers, the melons, the pumpkins, and the squashes. A minimum of 1 and out to 3 miles away is what you're going to have to keep those varieties separated, which is basically impractical for the home gardener. So that's why I say that spacing is not the best method of trying to prevent the cross-pollination. Timing is a little bit better, but still not the best. And what I mean by timing is you want to stagger the planting of your different varieties so that they're not blooming at the same time. So that's one way that you might be able to prevent cross-pollination. However, when you got a crop like tomatoes that has such a long period of bloom and production, it gets to be a little bit difficult to use timing as a staggered planting as a means to prevent the cross-pollination. The most foolproof and yet the most labor-intensive way to make sure that you have reliable protection from cross-pollination is for you to actually go out there and hand-pollinate the crops that you're wanting to protect from cross-pollination. This means that you have to physically transfer the pollen from the anther to the stigma. In other words, you get to be the bee when it comes to this. More specifically about how you go about doing that in tomatoes. But regardless of whatever crop you're hand-pollinating, once that flower, that desired flower is pollinated, you got to prevent it from being cross-pollinated by another means. So that means you're going to need to protect that flower, usually by, after pollinating, either covering the flower with a paper bag or a fine mesh bag like an onion bag to prevent any insects from getting in there and contaminating your pollination that you've done. Never use a plastic bag for this purpose, because that flower has still got to be able to breathe, and so a fine mesh bag or a paper bag is what you want to limit yourself to. Now I do want to take a moment here to say, if you're not planning on saving seed and you're just wanting to eat the fruit that you've produced, cross-pollination is not an issue. Cross-pollination is not going to affect the fruit that you eat. The only time cross-pollination is going to come into effect here is if you're planning on saving the seed for next year. But there is one crop, and I get this question quite a bit, that is affected. What you harvest that year and eat is affected by cross-pollination, and that's sweet corn. If you're growing sweet corn and it happens to get cross-pollinated with pollen from, say, field corn or popcorn, and in some cases another sweet corn variety, it is going to affect the harvestable corn that you get that year. For example, if it's sweet corn is crossed with field corn, your sweet corn is not going to be as sweet and tender as you expect it to be. In fact, it's probably not even going to be fitting to eat. So cross-pollination does affect the quality of sweet corn if you're growing that. So that's why it's very important. Try to keep your sweet corn from getting cross-pollinated by another variety of corn. We'll talk a little bit about flower anatomy before we go on. And I have here a line drawing of a typical perfect flowered plant, and we're really only concerned with two parts of that, and that's the anther there at the left, which is the male organ that produces the pollen, and then you got the stigma there in the center, which is the receiver of the pollen, and that's the beginning of the female organs of the flower. Pollination involves moving that pollen from the anther to the stigma. Once it gets on the stigma, the pollen will germinate a little tube that goes down into the ovary, that goes down to the ovules, it fertilizes the ovules. Once the ovule is fertilized and set, we consider that to be a seed, and then from that point on, the ovary is going to continue to develop into a fruit to protect that seed. If we don't get seed set, there's no need for the ovary to produce the fruit, and therefore if we don't get good pollination, don't get good fertilization, we're not going to get any fruit. That's the bottom line when it comes to it. So when it comes to pollination and preserving your crops, the varieties, we're wanting to control that process. This is a picture of a cross section or a line drawing of a cross section of a tomato blossom, and you'll notice that it looks a little bit different than that perfect flowered generic picture I had before, but it's still a perfect flowered plant. The difference is the tube, if you're familiar with a tomato blossom, and we'll show a real tomato blossom picture here in a few minutes, the stigma and the female parts are enclosed in a yellow tube, and those yellow tubes are actually the male parts of the flower that protect the stigma, and at the top of it, it is the anthers. Now in the more modern varieties, that anther is going to be above that stigma so that self-pollination can take place in the tomatoes. And for our modern varieties, that's generally how it takes place. Here's another picture of a little more detail about the tomato flower. There again, you can see the stigmas being protected by the anthers or by the stamen with the anthers on the end of it. And so when a modern variety is pollinated, all it takes is just shaking that blossom and get that pollen to drop from the anthers to the stigma, and we get self-pollination. But now here's a line drawing of what you'll find in a lot of the older varieties that you're going to deal with heirloom varieties. And you see there the stigma is actually protruding beyond the anthers. The pollen in those anthers will never reach that stigma without some help. So these older varieties, even though they are self-fertile, they do require some method. In nature, they have to actually be cross-pollinated in order to get that pollen to the stigma. And that's the part that we want to control to make sure we're getting our varieties true to type. So here's a picture of a typical tomato blossom. Most of you are probably familiar with that when it's fully open. You've got the yellow petals that's pulled back with the tube coming out the front. That tube is actually the stamens that has the anther, the male part containing the pollen. This happens to be a flower, one of the more modern varieties, so the stigma is being protected by that tube, and it's being protected from cross-pollination. And therefore, those plants, for the most part, are self-fruitful, self-fertile, can be self-pollinated. Now, if you want to pollinate on your own one of these modern varieties, basically all you got to do is shake the blossom, and it's going to drop the pollen down, and it's going to get pollinated. In a greenhouse tomato growing situation, though, they don't have the benefit of the wind blowing the plant, so your commercial greenhouse tomato growers will actually go out there with something like a electric toothbrush about every other day and just take the toothbrush and buzz each of the blossoms to get that pollen to shake off, or they may buy bumblebee colonies and put in in the greenhouse. And in some cases, some people have good success with taking a leaf blower in the greenhouse and blowing those plants to get that pollen to drop. If this was outdoors, you wouldn't have to do any of that with a modern variety, because just the movement of the wind blowing those plants will cause the pollination to take place. Now what I have here is an actual picture of a blossom from an old heirloom variety tomato. And if you see there, if you look at the tube there at the bottom left, you'll see that stigma protruding out beyond the anthers. In this next picture, I've actually got that circled so you can get a real world view of what I'm talking about with these older varieties. Makes them very susceptible to being cross-pollinated, and when it comes time for you to pollinate these plants by hand, you can't merely just go out there and shake the blossoms and expect it to get pollinated. We actually got to go through a detailed process of getting this done in the older varieties. So here is the beginning steps of doing this. This person is collecting some blossoms from pollen source that they want, and they'll take those blossoms and they'll shake that pollen off into some type of container, and then they'll go to the flowers that they want to pollinate, and they'll do what's called emasculation. And in emasculation, what you do is you remove everything off that flower except for the female parts. And it's perfectly fine to do that. That flower does not need any of the parts that you remain. But what that does is it exposes the stigma where you can easily go up there and dip the end of the stigma into your pollen source, or you can take a paintbrush and get some of that pollen on the end of it and brush the end of the stigma. That's how you facilitate pollination this way. And one of the resources I'm going to mention at the end of the program goes into great detail. In fact, a couple of them go into great detail about how to do this emasculation process and facilitate the pollination. Now, once you have pollinated the flower that you want to keep, it is imperative that you protect that flower from getting any other pollen in it until it sets fruit. In other words, you want to prevent a bumblebee or something coming along and dropping some pollen from an undesirable source on there. And the way to do that, as I mentioned earlier, is you can see in this picture, the flower's been covered up with a mesh bag so that no insect can get in there. You can also do it with a paper bag. Again, don't do it with a plastic bag, because that plant needs to be able to breathe. And you want to leave that on there until you get fruit set. You start seeing the fruit develop. Now this picture here, you don't have to wait until the fruit gets that large, but at least you see the fruit develop, and you want to keep it protected from any further pollination. Now when it comes to harvesting these seeds, and it varies from crop to crop, but as a rule of thumb, at least in fruit crops, that fruit should be ripe and mature before you harvest it and collect that seed out of there. With tomatoes, we take ripe fruit, cut it up and allow it to ferment before removing the seed. Now the reason we allow it to ferment is because if you ever cut open a tomato and you notice that gelatinous material in the lobes that contains the seed, well, that gelatinous material prevents that seed from germinating too early. In other words, we don't want the seed to start germinating while it's still in the fruit. So in nature, when that fruit falls off, if it germinates too early, it may germinate before winter sets in. And of course, tomatoes do not like cold weather. If they germinate too early, those plants will be killed and not be able to come back next year. So that gelatinous material in there prevents it from germinating too early, but we want to remove that before we store our seed, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Take a crop such as summer squash. We normally harvest summer squash while it's still immature, but if we're going to save seed from that fruit, we actually need to let it mature on the vine, just like we do with winter squash. And once those fruit are mature, we harvest them and we cut them up and remove the seed from them and clean them out. And we don't have to ferment them like we would, say, a tomato. And then a crop like beans, once the pods are filled and mature, we'll pull up the whole plant of the bean and hang it upside down in a dry protected area for a few weeks and let it dry out before we actually remove the bean seed from the pods. So let's talk more specifically about harvesting the seed from the tomatoes. Many of us that grow tomatoes know that when a tomato starts to turn just at least a little bit at the blossom end of the fruit, that we can pick it at that point and it's going to continue ripening. A lot of people like to do that because they don't like to let their tomatoes get overripe on the vine. But if you're going to harvest the seeds from that fruit, you need to let it completely ripen on the vine and even beyond what we would consider completely ripened. And don't let it rot on the vine, but maybe let it soften up a little bit more than what you would normally harvest it. We need to make sure that those tomato seeds, the majority of them, are mature and that you're going to get good success out of it. So we want to leave that fruit on the vine as long as we possibly can. And once we pick it, we're either going to cut the fruit in the quarter-sized pieces or smaller, or if you want to eat the fruit in addition to collecting the seed, just scoop out the gelatinous material. You're going to put this cut up tomato or the gelatinous material with the seeds into a container such as a mason canning jar. And you're going to fill it up with just enough water so that you can mix it up. And then you're going to let it set for 48 to 72 hours with a loose covering of it, maybe just a piece of paper towel over it, more or less just to prevent the fruit flies from getting in there. You're going to keep it in a place that maintains somewhere between 70 and 85 degrees. Basically your kitchen counter, but keeping it out of direct sunlight. And it's going to take about 48 to 72 hours to ferment properly. And you're going to need to stir it about 2 or 3 times a day during that 2 to 3 day period. And this is just a picture of a tomato that's been cut up to be put into the slurry. This is someone just scooping out the seed with the gelatinous material in there. This is fine if you're doing a small amount. If you're doing a large amount, like on a commercial basis, you want to cut it up like you see there in that slide. And this is just some jars in which that slurry is in the process of fermenting. One of the things we need to be careful of, though, is we don't want those seeds to stay in there for too long. We want to make sure that we remove those seeds as quickly after fermentation as we possibly can. So how do we know that fermentation has completed? There's several ways of going about doing that. Some people judge it by the bubbling of the materials. It stops bubbling. Obviously the fermentation process is over with. There's a white mold that will grow, and if it happens early, don't worry about it. You can stir that white mold back in there. It's not going to hurt anything, but if that white mold has completely covered the top of your slurry, then fermentation has stopped. But probably the most reliable method of making sure that you get it in time is to make sure that gel is completely removed from the seed. And the way you do that is probably starting in the second day or 24 hours after you start the process. You should remove a small sample of the seed, rinse them off real good. If the seed are no longer slippery in your fingers, then the gel is removed, the fermentation is stopped. You need to get it out of there. If we leave it in there too long, it can damage the seed. And if you start seeing seed germinating in the slurry, you've already got damaged seed. So it's very important that you watch this fermentation process and get the seed out as soon as it stops, and in my opinion, checking the seed ever so often to make sure that the gel has been removed is the best way to do that. Now after fermentation has taken place, we want to separate the pulp and the bad seed from the good seed. And during the fermentation process, the pulp is going to float to the top along with the bad seed. Your good seed are going to settle down to the bottom. So we want to separate those two. And we do that in a process called decanting. And the way you go about doing this is you get you a larger container that holds about at least 5 to 10 times the volume of the container you did the fermentation in. Pour your solution in that container, fill it up with water, mix it. Allow it to set for a few minutes. Eventually the pulp and the bad seed should float back up to the top. The good seed, as I mentioned earlier, will float down to the bottom. And then you just scoop off the bad seed and the pulp off. And you may need to do that process 2 or 3 times to get it good and clean. But once your pulp and your bad seed are removed, you want to pour that solution through a strainer to collect that good seed. And once you've done that, spread that good seed out either on a cookie sheet or a piece of wax paper or something of that nature. Spread it out so that it can dry. Room temperature is good to dry it on the counter of your kitchen. Again, just don't let it sit in full sunlight or direct sunlight. Now, once you've done that, we've got to think about storing the tomato seed. And you got to always keep in mind that a seed is a living organism. It's not dead. And because of that, there are certain requirements that we got to do to keep that seed alive and viable so it will germinate when we get ready to plant that seed. So we want to keep it in a cool, dry place. For the most part, you can keep it in a kitchen cabinet where it stays dry, stays about room temperature. That's enough to keep them at least over 1 or 2 years. If you want to extend the shelf life of that seed, then you can also store them in the refrigerator. And if you want to further extend the shelf life of that seed, they can actually be frozen. Now, the range that's always given on the viability of tomato seed is a range of 4 to 10 years, but you're only going to get beyond that 4 years if you freeze the seed. I wouldn't rely on a batch of seed that's older than 4 years. And so what I would suggest to you, if you're not going to save your seed every year, is that you at least do a germination test on it at the beginning of each year. And a germination test is very simple. You pull out a sample of the seed, you lay them on a piece of moist paper towel, put that into a plastic bag and seal it up. In no more than 5 days, that tomato seed should have germinated. So you go then and you count the number that have germinated, compare it to the ones to the total amount of seed you put in there, and you get a percentage. Now I like to see a percentage of 90% or better, especially if I'm buying the seed. But if you start seeing your germination getting below 70%, it's probably time for you to collect another batch of seed that season. I prefer to see you at least count on, again, if you're not doing it every year, at least count on every 3rd year that you plan on collecting a batch of seed to make sure that you maintain that variety. If you wait too long and your seed are bad, then you've lost your work there. You're going to have to start all over again. You're going to have to go buy more seed. Or if you're trying to maintain one of your family heirlooms, which some people do, if you wait too late to collect a new batch of seed, you've lost that variety. So just keep that in mind. Probably at least every 3rd year is a good time to make sure that you collect a new batch of seed. So I want to leave you here with a few resources of information if you want to delve deeper into this, get some information that I'm not able to get into this presentation today. The first one is a book, and the rest of them are free resources online that you can get, go into more detail about saving seed. The first one is a book called Seed to Seed, Seed Saving and Growing Techniques for Vegetable Gardeners by Suzanne Ashworth. And you can find this book at most any bookstore, even through some of the gardening catalogs. Probably considered the Bible when it comes to saving seed. And this is a general seed saving book. It doesn't confine itself to one crop. Covers about any type of vegetable crop that you may think about growing. Now the rest of these are online sources. And starting with the Organic Seed Alliance, if you'll just Google Organic Seed Alliance, it actually has 2 publications that will be of value to you. The first one in PDF format is called A Seed Saving Guide for Gardeners and Farmers. And it's about a 30-page document, very concise. Doesn't go into as much detail as the book by Suzanne Ashworth, but it gives you basically everything you need to know for a wide variety of vegetable seed that you might want to save. The second publication is actually specific to tomatoes, and it's appropriately titled Tomato Seed Production Guide. So it goes through a lot of the things I've talked about, even as far as emasculating the blossoms of the tomato and how to facilitate hand pollination on down to the actual harvesting of the seed. The next publication again is online, put out by the University of Florida Extension, and it's called Hand Pollination of Tomato for Breeding and Seed Production. So it goes into great detail about the hand pollination process in producing tomato seed true to type. The next one that I will point out to you is put out by the University of California at Davis, and it's Guidelines for Emasculating and Pollinating Tomatoes, and it gives a good picture by picture process of how to emasculate those flowers that you want to pollinate and how to facilitate the pollination. The next one is put out by Clemson Extension. Again, it's online, and it's called Heirloom Vegetables, and it just talks about heirloom vegetables in general. It doesn't specify tomatoes. And the last resource I'll throw out there is put out by the University of Missouri, and it's called Why Not Hybrid Seeds. And so that publication goes into more detail about the production of hybrid seeds and gives you a good background as to why generally you wouldn't want to save those seeds from hybrid plants to plant the next season. Goes into more detail than I could go in this program today. To sum up what we've talked about here today, began by talking about why heirloom vegetables, which primarily I said the flavor. It's hard to beat the flavor of a homegrown tomato, but it's even harder to beat the flavor of some of those homegrown heirloom heirloom tomato varieties. So if you want to open yourself up to a whole plethora of taste and colors and textures of tomatoes, you should try some of these heirloom tomatoes. I don't think you'll be disappointed in it. Again, for nostalgic reasons, it's just a lot of fun to grow some of those varieties that your grandparents, your parents grew in the garden when you were growing up. There's some curiosity to these varieties. As I pointed out, there's some novelty varieties out there. Some of the challenges to it include that these varieties are not as strong against pests and diseases. They're a lot of time they're low vigor. We do have to watch out the prevent cross-pollination, so that we do get these varieties that's true to type. And finally, we do need to understand plant variety protection. If we're saving our own seed, we want to make sure we're not violating some copyright laws and regulations and get ourselves in trouble. But for the most part, this is not going to be a big issue for most home gardeners. With that, I just want to thank you for your attention here today. If you have any more questions concerning heirloom tomatoes or heirloom vegetables in general, seed saving and pollination, don't hesitate to give me a call. Thank you, and you have a great evening.